You are particularly passionate about collaboration between uncommon stakeholders. Why is it important for organisations from all industries to come together and tackle climate change?
So a lot of global problems are too big to be challenged by a single organisation. So this is why collaboration is really key. And of course, there's lots of different actors, whether that's governments or private sector or academia or NGOs or the military or civil society organisations. And we all are experiencing a lot of these global problems and trying to act on them. But it's really only by coming together that we're actually likely to be able to achieve the kind of transformational change that's needed. So something that's as big and as complex and as multifaceted as climate change that needs to have this very cohesive global approach to tackling it, but will have very localized impacts in a lot of cases. It really can only be done through kind of this kind of cohesion and really multilateral collaboration.
Which sociobiological factors must we consider in the fight against climate change?
This is such an interesting one because this is, of course, there's a lot around mitigation that we need to be doing. So we need to be thinking about our carbon emissions, but also other greenhouse gases as well. So there's the physical elements of it. So that's how do we reduce our reliance on carbon and fossil fuel heavy industries, whether that's energy or in the housing sector and so on. But also one of the key things that I think has come out over the last few years that's particularly interesting is one of the ways of building up resilience to climate is through socioeconomic approaches. So if you build up people's literacy, ability to access livelihoods and so on, if you increase gender parity, then challenging those vulnerabilities itself is a climate response. It's a climate adaptation response. So for example, if a company is wanting to take action on climate change, they absolutely need to be thinking about their carbon footprint. They need to be thinking about their supply chains, but they also need to be thinking about it from the perspective of those kind of human factors. So thinking about what is the resilience that they can be building across their supply chains, in their workforces and so on. So it kind of requires this sort of multi-level thinking that we need to be thinking about physical impacts, but also all these socioeconomic factors as well. And I think if you're thinking about it from a government perspective, there's policy incentives. And again, that needs to be about the sort of physical impacts, preparing for climate change impacts, thinking about climate adaptation, but again, also thinking about what are the inequalities or vulnerabilities in our society and what are the policy responses that we need to be generating in order to build up the resilience across those areas as well.
What role do risk and crisis management play in our fight against climate change?
So it's something about a mentality, I think, and to kind of bring together the two most sort of recent roles that I've held. So at Forum, we spend a lot of work thinking about futures, thinking about future trends, future scenarios, how the world might potentially look in 10 or 15, 20 years from now. And again, in the disaster response work, it's often about mapping ahead and trying to prepare for the unexpected. So it's trying to think ahead about the different scenarios, what the hurricane season might be like, for example. So there's something in that forward-looking mentality that I think is really critical. So if we're likely to be seeing much more discontinuity, many more discontinuous or disruptive events over the next decades, we need to be really fostering this kind of mindset of looking ahead and planning, knowing that it won't turn out exactly that way. So there's, the old adage is that plans are nothing, but planning is everything. So there's something in that thought process that's really critical to enable us to be better prepared for discontinuity and disruption. So this kind of forward-looking approach and trying to map ahead what those multiple factors might be, but also how they interact with each other as well. How does a physical climatic event interact with the socioeconomic vulnerabilities in a particular place, and what does that interaction mean? So yeah, it's quite complex and quite challenging, but I think it's one of the key challenges for leadership over the next decades is being able to foster this forward-looking mentality and being able to see interconnections between different trends.
What message do you have for businesses not already investing in sustainable changes?
So I think for businesses who are only beginning the journey on sustainability, of course, one of the key things is really to get aligned on footprint management. So thinking about your climate mitigation strategies. But it isn't just a simple story about reducing carbon. That's absolutely critical, but it's also understanding the sort of more complex risks that exist across your supply chain. It's understanding how regulation and policy might be changing, because things are changing quite quickly, how investor or consumer expectations might be changing, because again, change is happening really quickly. So understanding that mitigation approach is also then about thinking about climate adaptation. What are going to be your adaptation needs in 5 years across your supply chain, in 10 years, in 20 years? And again, taking that forward-looking approach and thinking about that. I think one of the key things is a lot of this requires a mindset shift. So we've been lucky enough in the developed world to broadly enjoy quite a long period of stability. And that's unlikely to continue. And I think the events over the last couple of years have shown us that probably we can be expecting more disruption, unfortunately. So, global pandemic, now a war in Ukraine, a lot of volatility in the energy market, a lot of volatility in supply chains, and then pricing impacts of that. And what that shows us is that there's probably a more chaotic series of events ahead of us. So actually, companies almost need to be planning to be able to operate in that kind of discontinuous environment, rather than assuming a new normal of a steady state will emerge. It may not. And instead, it's actually really important for companies to be prepared for disruption. And then they will weather the storm much better, as well as reducing their own contributions to carbon as well.